Do you really believe God is a myth? The question, delivered with quiet authority, silenced the room. What followed wasn't just a conversation. It was a battle of beliefs, where Clint Eastwood's timeless wisdom faced off against modern skepticism, leaving everyone questioning their own convictions. The studio was a hive of quiet activity. Cameramen adjusted their angles, a sound technician monitored the levels, and Clint Eastwood's personal assistant stood near the back, clutching a clipboard with a mix of admiration and nervous anticipation. The room, with its sleek design and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, was a fitting backdrop for what was supposed to be a routine interview. But the tension in the air suggested otherwise. Clint Eastwood, at 94 years old, sat with the kind of ease that only comes from a lifetime of experience. His hands rested lightly on the arms of his chair, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. Across from him sat Alex Carter, a journalist in his mid-30s with a reputation for intellectual takedowns. Alex's wire-rimmed glasses and neatly combed hair gave him the air of a man who had spent more time in lecture halls than in the real world. His green cardigan and carefully chosen words marked him as a member of the liberal academic elite, someone who prided himself on his intellect and progressive ideals. Alex adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his tone polite but with an unmistakable edge. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, "you've often spoken about the importance of faith in your life. But don't you think faith, religion specifically, is outdated? I mean, isn't it just a myth people cling to because they're afraid to face reality?" The question was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they already knew the answer. Behind the cameras, the production team exchanged glances, sensing the tension. Clint's assistant, standing near the back, bit her lip, her grip on the clipboard tightening. Clint didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, his piercing gaze fixed on Alex, who shifted slightly in his chair. When Clint finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the weight of decades of thought and experience. "You know," Clint began, "I've lived long enough to see a lot of things come and go. Trends, ideologies, movements, they all have their moment in the sun. But faith? Faith isn't a trend. It's not something you just move past. It's something that's been with us since the beginning, something that's helped people through the hardest times in their lives." Alex's lips pressed into a thin line, but he quickly recovered. "But isn't that just another way of saying it's a crutch? Something people cling to because they can't face reality?" Clint tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I've heard this all before." "A crutch, huh?" Clint said, leaning forward slightly. "Let me ask you something, Alex. Have you ever broken a leg?" The question caught Alex off guard. "What?" "A leg," Clint repeated. "Have you ever broken one?" "Well, no, but yeah." "Then let me tell you something about crutches," Clint said, his voice steady. "When you've got a broken leg, a crutch isn't a weakness. It's what helps you stand. It's what gets you through until you can walk on your own again. And faith? Faith is a lot like that. It's not about avoiding reality. It's about finding the strength to face it." The room was silent. Even the cameramen, who were usually focused on their work, seemed momentarily transfixed. Clint's assistant smiled faintly, her grip on the clipboard relaxing just a bit. But Alex wasn't ready to back down. He adjusted his glasses and tapped his pen against his notepad, as if searching for the perfect rebuttal. "Okay. But what about the harm religion has caused? Wars, oppression, discrimination? How do you justify all of that?" Clint sighed, not out of frustration, but with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime answering the same questions. "You know, Alex, it's easy to point to the worst examples of anything and use them to discredit the whole. But that's not the full picture, is it? For every war fought in the name of religion, there are 100 acts of kindness, 1,000 lives saved. 1,000,000 people who found hope when they had none. You don't hear about those in the headlines, but they're just as real. Alex opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. And let's not forget, Clint continued, his voice growing firmer, that a lot of the freedoms you enjoy today, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, even the right to sit here and question me, those didn't just appear out of thin air. They were built on a foundation of values, many of which come from faith. So before you throw it all out, maybe take a moment to think about what you're standing on. The assistant in the corner let out a quiet, involuntary, "Wow," before quickly covering her mouth. The cameramen exchanged glances, one of them mouthing, "Did you hear that?" Alex's face turned red, but he forced a smile, determined to regain control of the conversation. "Fine," Alex said, his voice tight. "But don't you think it's time we stopped looking to the past and started focusing on the future? Isn't clinging to faith just holding us back?" Clint chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You know, Alex, I've been hearing that same argument for decades. Out with the old, in with the new. But here's the thing about faith. It's not about clinging to the past. It's about learning from it. It's about taking what works, what stood the test of time, and using it to build something better." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You don't build a house by tearing down the foundation. You build on it. And if you're smart, you make it stronger." The assistant's clipboard slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. The cameramen were no longer pretending to adjust their equipment. They were fully engrossed in the conversation. Alex, however, was visibly frustrated. He glanced at his notes, then back at Clint, searching for a way to turn the tide. "But what about people who don't share your faith? What about those who feel excluded by these so-called values you're defending?" Clint's expression softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Alex, I've been around long enough to know that no one's perfect. Not me, not you, not this country. But the beauty of faith is that it's not about exclusion. It's about aspiration. It's about striving to be better, to do better, to leave the world a little better than you found it." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "And if that's not something worth holding on to, then I don't know what is." The assistant, now crouched on the floor to retrieve her clipboard, whispered to herself, "Incredible." The conversation wasn't over yet, but the room already felt like it had shifted. Clint Eastwood wasn't just answering questions. He was teaching a masterclass in perspective, one that left everyone, including Alex, questioning their assumptions. Alex adjusted his glasses again, a nervous habit that betrayed the calm, intellectual demeanor he was trying to project. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table between them, and his voice took on a sharper edge. "Mr. Eastwood, I understand that faith might have personal value for you. But don't you think it's dangerous to promote something that isn't based on evidence? Science has given us answers to questions that religion could only speculate about for centuries. Isn't it time we let go of these outdated beliefs and embraced reason instead?" Behind the cameras, the production team exchanged uneasy glances. The sound technician subtly turned up Clint's microphone, as if anticipating that his response would be worth capturing in perfect clarity. Clint's assistant, still crouched on the floor with her clipboard, froze in place, her eyes fixed on the two men. Clint didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrest, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make Alex squirm. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a weight that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. "Alex," Clint began, "you talk about science and evidence like they're the only things that matter. And don't get me wrong, I've got a lot of respect for science. It's given us incredible things: medicine, technology, the ability to understand the world in ways our ancestors couldn't even dream of. But here's the thing. Science can tell you how the world works. It can tell you about atoms and galaxies and everything in between. But it can't tell you why we're here. It can't tell you what it all means. Alex opened his mouth to interject, but Clint held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me finish," Clint said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You see, faith isn't about replacing science. It's about answering the questions science can't. It's about purpose, meaning, morality. Those aren't things you can measure in a lab or calculate with an equation. They're things you feel, things you know deep down, even if you can't explain them." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the studio lights. Even the cameramen, who were usually focused on their work, seemed momentarily transfixed. Alex, however, wasn't ready to concede. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, and his voice took on a more combative tone. "But isn't that just another way of saying faith is based on feelings, not facts? How can you trust something that can't be proven?" Clint tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I've heard this all before." "Let me ask you something, Alex," Clint said, his voice steady. "Do you love your parents?" The question caught Alex off guard. "What?" "Your parents," Clint repeated. "Do you love them?" "Well, yes, of course," Alex replied, his tone defensive. "And can you prove it?" Clint asked, his gaze unwavering. Alex blinked, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean?" "Of course I can. I mean, I care for them. I support them. "That's not proof," Clint interrupted gently. "That's evidence. But it's not the same thing, is it? You can't measure love in a test tube. You can't weigh it on a scale. But you know it's real. You feel it. And that's what faith is like. It's not about proving something beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's about knowing it in your heart, even when you can't explain it." The assistant in the corner let out a quiet, involuntary gasp, her clipboard slipping from her hands again. The cameramen exchanged glances, one of them mouthing, "Did you hear that?" Alex's face turned red, but he forced a smile, determined to regain control of the conversation. "Fine," Alex said, his voice tight. "But don't you think faith has been used to justify some of the worst atrocities in history? Wars, oppression, discrimination. How do you reconcile that with the idea of a loving God?" Clint sighed, not out of frustration, but with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime answering the same questions. "You know, Alex, it's easy to point to the worst examples of anything and use them to discredit the whole. But that's not the full picture, is it? For every war fought in the name of religion, there are 100 acts of kindness, 1,000 lives saved, 1,000,000 people who found hope when they had none. You don't hear about those in the headlines, but they're just as real." Alex opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "And let's not forget," Clint continued, his voice growing firmer, "that a lot of the freedoms you enjoy today, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, even the right to sit here and question me, those didn't just appear out of thin air. They were built on a foundation of values, many of which come from faith. So before you throw it all out, maybe take a moment to think about what you're standing on." The assistant, now crouched on the floor to retrieve her clipboard, whispered to herself, "Incredible." Alex's frustration was palpable. He glanced at his notes, then back at Clint, searching for a way to turn the tide. "But what about people who don't share your faith? What about those who feel excluded by these so-called values you're defending?" Clint's expression softened, and for the first time there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Alex, I've been around long enough to know that no one's perfect. Not me, not you, not this country. But the beauty of faith is that it's not about exclusion. It's about aspiration. It's about striving to be better, to do better, to leave the world a little better than you found it. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. And if that's not something worth holding on to, then I don't know what is. The assistant, now crouched on the floor to retrieve her clipboard, whispered to herself, "Incredible." The conversation wasn't over yet, but the room already felt like it had shifted. Clint Eastwood wasn't just answering questions. He was teaching a masterclass in perspective, one that left everyone, including Alex, questioning their assumptions. Before we dive into the conclusion of this incredible conversation, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Are you tuning in from the heartland, the coasts, or somewhere in between? And if you're enjoying this exchange of ideas, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community for more stories that cut through the noise and get to the heart of what really matters. Now, let's get back to Clint Eastwood and the conversation that left everyone speechless. Alex Carter was visibly rattled now. His carefully constructed arguments, the ones that had worked so well in his previous interviews, seemed to crumble under the weight of Clint Eastwood's calm, unshakable wisdom. But he wasn't ready to give up. He adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and leaned forward, his voice tinged with desperation. "Mr. Eastwood," Alex began, "you've spoken a lot about faith and its importance in your life. But what about people who have suffered unimaginable tragedies? People who have lost loved ones, who have faced injustice, who have prayed and received no answers. How can you believe in a God who allows so much suffering?" The room fell silent. Even the faint hum of the studio lights seemed to fade as everyone waited for Clint's response. Behind the cameras, the production team held their breath, and Clint's assistant clutched her clipboard tightly, her knuckles white. Clint leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him, and his voice, when he spoke, was softer than before. "That's a fair question, Alex, and it's one I've asked myself more times than I can count." Alex blinked, clearly not expecting such an honest admission. Clint continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "I've seen my share of suffering in this world. I've lost people I cared about. I've seen good people face things they didn't deserve. And yeah, there were times when I wondered why. Why would a loving God allow that? But here's what I've come to understand. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trust. It's about believing that even when we don't understand, there's a bigger picture we can't see." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You see, Alex, life isn't fair. It never has been, and it never will be. But faith gives us the strength to face that unfairness, to find meaning in the chaos, and to keep going, even when it feels like the world is against us." Alex opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "And let me tell you something else," Clint said, his voice growing firmer. "Suffering doesn't disprove God. If anything, it proves how much we need Him. Because when you're at your lowest, when you've got nothing left, faith is what keeps you standing. It's what gives you hope when there's no reason to hope. And that's not a myth, Alex. That's real." The assistant in the corner wiped a tear from her eye, her clipboard forgotten on the floor. The cameramen exchanged glances, one of them whispering, "This is incredible." Alex sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For the first time in the interview, he seemed at a loss for words. He glanced down at his notes, then back at Clint, as if searching for a way to regain control of the conversation. "But what about people who don't believe?" Alex asked finally, his voice quieter now. "What about those who find meaning without faith? Are they missing something?" Clint smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried no judgment, only understanding. "Alex, I'm not here to tell anyone how to live their life. Everyone's got their own path to walk. But I'll tell you this. Faith has given me more than I could ever put into words. It's given me strength, purpose, and a sense of peace that nothing else ever could. And if someone finds that in another way, well, that's their journey. But for me, I wouldn't trade it for anything. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't just respect, it was awe. Even those who disagreed with Clint's views couldn't deny the power of his words. Alex leaned back in his chair, his hands resting in his lap, and for the first time, he looked less like a journalist and more like a man who was genuinely searching for answers. "I have to admit," Alex said quietly, "I didn't expect this conversation to go this way." Clint chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Life's full of surprises, Alex. That's part of what makes it worth living." The assistant, now standing again, clutched her clipboard to her chest and whispered to herself, "Unbelievable." As the interview wrapped up, Clint stood and extended his hand to Alex. "Thanks for the questions," Clint said with a small smile. "You made me think. I hope I did the same for you." Alex hesitated for a moment, then shook Clint's hand, his grip firm but not overpowering. "You did," Alex admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. And as Clint Eastwood walked out of the studio, the room erupted into quiet applause. Not just for the man, but for the values he represented. Values that, despite the noise of modern life, still resonated deeply with those willing to listen. What do you think about Clint's perspective? Do you agree with his views on faith and its role in our lives? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen.